On an ordinary Tuesday morning, Barron Trump walked into a supermarket, but not as himself. He wore the plain blue uniform of a cashier, complete with a name tag that simply read Barry, for the son of a former U.S. president. This disguise marked the beginning of an unusual social experiment. His goal? To immerse himself in a life he had never truly understood and see how people treated the workers who kept everyday life running smoothly. The supermarket bustled with activity, carts squeaking along tiled floors, the rhythmic beeping of registers, and the chatter of shoppers debating brands of cereal. It was a cacophony of routine that Barron found oddly overwhelming. He stood behind his assigned register, running items over the scanner with deliberate care, trying to adjust to the repetitive rhythm. His hands, which had once been used to effortlessly flipping through books, playing piano, or navigating touchscreens, now fumbled clumsily with barcodes and crinkling bags. Within the first hour, Barron was already feeling a kind of tiredness he hadn't expected, a combination of mental fatigue and physical strain. Sweat began to gather under his collar as he realized he had taken the comfort of his usual life for granted. The people in front of him treated him as if he were invisible, barely sparing a glance as they barked orders like, "Double bag that," or "Don't squash the bread." A heavy-set woman in a floral shirt had even scolded him for being too slow, muttering, "Young people these days don't know what hard work is." He forced himself to smile politely, but deep inside, his thoughts were spinning. "Do I ever really think about the lives of people like this?" he wondered. "Have I ever shown them gratitude for what they do?" Lost in these musings, Barron didn't notice the imposing figure stepping into his line until he heard the sharp thud of items hitting the counter. His eyes flicked upward. A tall man in a tailored navy suit, perfectly groomed, stood there. The man's presence radiated authority. His sleek, combed-back hair and icy expression gave him the air of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His fingers tapped briskly on the screen of his phone, and his foot drummed a sharp, impatient rhythm on the floor. The man didn't look up, not even to acknowledge Barron's presence. Instead, he tossed a credit card onto the counter with the same indifference as he might throw a napkin into the trash. Barron instinctively picked it up, running it through the machine without a word. The man's attention remained glued to his phone, his thumbs scrolling furiously as if the contents of his email were far more urgent than the young man standing before him. Scanning the items, a carton of eggs, a loaf of artisan bread, a bottle of imported sparkling water, Barron couldn't shake a growing sense of familiarity. The man's every movement, from the way he adjusted his cufflinks to the barely perceptible arch of his eyebrows, felt eerily reminiscent of people Barron had encountered in his former life of privilege. Yet there was no warmth, no acknowledgement of the human being working on the other side of the counter. This wasn't just indifference, it was a deliberate kind of dismissal. As Barron continued his work, a line began to form behind the man. A mother juggling a crying toddler and a cart full of diapers sighed loudly. A construction worker in a dirt-streaked vest muttered under his breath about rich folks thinking they own the world. The man in the suit seemed oblivious to the building frustration around him. He was an island unto himself, untouched by the currents of the everyday struggles unfolding mere feet away. For Barron, the moment was a revelation. Having grown up in a world where people bent over backward to meet his every need, he had never felt this kind of invisibility. The cashiers he had passed by without a second thought, the hotel staff who worked tirelessly in the background, the drivers who ferried him from place to place, they were all suddenly very real to him now. And in this role, behind the counter with aching feet and a forced smile, he could finally see the stark difference between those who showed kindness and those who didn't bother. As he handed the suited man his receipt, Barron felt the weight of an unspoken lesson pressing down on him. This wasn't just about experiencing a different perspective. It was about understanding his own role in a world that often valued status over humanity. But the man wasn't done yet. He glanced at the receipt, then back at Barron, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You charged me for 2 loaves," he said flatly, his voice clipped and cold. Barron froze. He checked the screen, realizing the error immediately. "I'm so sorry, sir," he said, fumbling to correct it. The man sighed audibly, as though Barron's mistake was the gravest inconvenience imaginable, and crossed his arms, his impatience filling the space like an unspoken reprimand. As Barron processed the refund, his mind raced. He couldn't help but wonder how often this man, or others like him, treated those in service roles this way. The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, offering a small, apologetic smile as he handed over the corrected receipt. "About time," the man muttered, grabbing his items without a word of thanks. And just like that, he was gone, leaving behind a cloud of tension that seemed to dissipate only when the next customer, a kind elderly woman, stepped up to the register with a warm smile. For Barron, the contrast between the two interactions was a jarring reminder of the humanity, or lack thereof, in everyday encounters. As the day wore on, Barron continued to process the weight of what he was learning. His experiment was only beginning, but it was already revealing truths he hadn't expected. The screen flashed the notification. Barron Trump blinked, surprised. A declined card. This wasn't something he expected. The wealthy man immediately looked up, his cold, authoritative eyes locking onto Barron. "What did you say? Declined?" His voice was sharp, slicing through the air like a knife. "Sometimes the chip doesn't read properly," Barron replied, his tone calm despite the man's growing anger. "You can try again." The man snatched the card, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. He shoved the card back into the machine, swiping it forcefully this time, as if trying to make it work through sheer willpower. The machine beeped again. Card declined. The man's face turned crimson with fury. His jaw clenched as he pulled the card out. The expensive watch on his wrist gleamed under the supermarket's lights. But for the first time, his wealth and status offered no advantage. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from barely contained rage. "What the hell is this? Your machine broken or something?" he shouted, his voice loud enough to draw glances from nearby customers. A few stole quick looks, but most turned away, unwilling to get involved. Barron remained composed. "The machine is working fine, sir. It might be an issue with your card. Would you like to try another one?" The man's glare was sharp enough to pierce steel. His pride had clearly taken a hit. In his world, things like this didn't happen. He was used to everything going his way. Muttering a quiet curse, he rummaged through his wallet and pulled out another card. Sleek, black, and unmistakably exclusive. Without a word, he tossed it onto the counter, his expression laced with disdain. Barron picked up the card and ran it through the machine. A tense silence stretched between them, like a fragile thread ready to snap at any moment. The machine beeped, approved. The man exhaled, a brief wave of relief crossing his face before it was replaced with a sneer of contempt. He grabbed his bag with a forceful tug, his action so rough that a carton of eggs fell to the floor. The eggs shattered, their yolks spilling across the tiles. The man didn't even glance back. Instead, he kicked a can of soda toward Barron, his eyes full of contempt. Barron stood still, his hands gripping the counter. He had anticipated witnessing the true nature of people, but this was beyond anything he had expected. For a fleeting moment, Barron considered revealing his identity, letting the man know that the cashier he had just insulted was actually the son of one of the most powerful men in the country. But he didn't. Barron simply remained silent, watching as the man strode out of the store, his gait oozing self-importance, leaving behind a mess of broken eggs and spilled soda. The customers nearby exchanged awkward glances, unsure of what to do, but no one stepped forward to intervene or help. Barron stayed rooted in place. He wasn't angry, not exactly. What he felt was something deeper: disappointment, sadness, and a reminder of why he had embarked on this experiment in the first place. But as he bent down to pick up the shattered eggshells, something unexpected happened. The wealthy man strode through the bustling supermarket like a ship cutting through waves, oblivious to the chaos he left in his wake. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the tiles, the sound commanding attention even though he gave none. He exuded an aura of untouchable authority, a man so used to the world bending to his will that he barely noticed the people around him. As he passed the checkout area, his broad shoulder collided with a middle-aged woman guiding a small child. The impact sent the woman stumbling slightly, her worn leather bag slipping from her grasp. Its contents spilled across the floor in a cacophony of small, everyday objects: a half-empty wallet, a few crumpled receipts, a pack of tissues, and a modest array of groceries. The man didn't slow down. He didn't turn to look or offer an apology. Instead, he muttered under his breath, his tone cold and dripping with disdain, "Watch where you're going." The woman froze for a moment, as if the words stung more than the collision itself. She didn't retort, didn't demand the apology she deserved. Instead, she knelt on the floor, her hands trembling slightly as she began gathering her scattered belongings. Her face was pale and lined with exhaustion, her eyes reflecting a quiet resignation that spoke volumes. This wasn't the first time she'd been treated this way. It likely wouldn't be the last. Barron Trump, standing behind the register a few feet away, witnessed the entire scene. Time seemed to slow as he took it all in: the man's callous disregard, the woman's silent acceptance, the child tugging at her arm with innocent confusion. A sharp pang of sorrow pierced Barron's chest. He felt the woman's helplessness as if it were his own, and the man's indifference hit him like a slap. This was exactly what he had hoped to uncover in his experiment: the everyday realities of how people in different stations of life treated one another. The automatic doors whooshed closed behind the wealthy man, but the atmosphere in the store remained tense. The noise of bustling shoppers seemed muffled, as if the air itself had grown heavy with unspoken injustice. Barron felt it pressing down on him, making his uniform feel tighter, the fluorescent lights harsher. He couldn't shake the scene from his mind. It wasn't the first time he had seen arrogance and self-importance. Growing up, he had witnessed it in subtle glances during family gatherings, in the ingratiating smiles of those seeking his father's favor, and even in the way some of his childhood friends carried themselves. But this was different. This wasn't a private dinner or a polished meeting room. This was raw, unfiltered humanity on full display. Barron's thoughts spiraled as he continued to scan items mechanically for the next customer. How often did people like the woman endure this kind of treatment? How often were they made to feel invisible, unimportant, or worse, like an inconvenience? Is this what they face every day? He wondered. The lack of respect, the dismissive tone, the careless bumps and glares. It was a reality he had never considered, a harsh contrast to the life he had always known, where every move he made was met with praise or indulgence. The realization hit him like a freight train. He, too, had been guilty of this, maybe not in the same overt, dismissive way as the man in the suit, but in subtler ways. There were times he had expected service without gratitude, times he had looked past the faces of those working quietly around him, times he had let his privilege shield him from understanding the struggles of others. A heavy feeling settled in his chest, a mix of guilt and awakening. He realized that this experiment wasn't just about understanding others. It was about understanding himself. The woman was still kneeling on the floor, her hands moving slowly as she placed items back into her bag. Her little boy stood beside her, his wide eyes flicking between her and the strangers passing by. Sensing something wrong but unable to articulate it, Barron couldn't stand there and do nothing. Without thinking, he stepped out from behind the counter, crouching beside her. "Here, let me help you," he said, his voice soft but steady. The woman glanced up, startled by the unexpected kindness. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, they filled with a mixture of gratitude and surprise. Barron reached for a box of crackers that had rolled a few feet away and handed it to her. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if each action carried the weight of an apology, not for what the man had done, but for what the world had allowed to happen. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a vulnerability that tugged at Barron's heart. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone sincere, his expression unguarded. The woman nodded, a small, tired smile breaking through the weariness etched across her face. "We're fine," she said, though her eyes hinted at a deeper struggle. Barron helped her gather the last few items, placing them gently into her bag. As she rose to her feet, he noticed the way she held her son's hand tightly, as if grounding herself in his small, innocent presence. The boy looked up at Barron with wide, curious eyes, and Barron gave him a reassuring smile. The moment lingered in the air, quiet but profound. It wasn't just an act of helping someone pick up their belongings. It was a connection, however fleeting, that bridged two vastly different worlds. For Barron, it was a glimpse into a life he had never truly understood. For the woman, perhaps it was a reminder that kindness could still be found in unexpected places. As Barron returned to his station, his mind was buzzing. The experiment was teaching him more than he had ever anticipated, revealing truths that cut deeper than he was prepared for. And yet, he welcomed it. Change, he realized, often began in moments like this, small, seemingly insignificant moments that carried the weight of something much larger. Barron Trump crouched down slowly, his knees brushing against the cold, tiled floor of the supermarket. The broken eggs lay in front of him, their golden yolks pooling across the tiles, streaked with fragments of shell. As he reached out, his fingers hesitated for a moment before sinking into the sticky mess. The texture was unpleasant, cold and slimy, clinging to his skin. It would have been easy to call for someone else to clean it up, a janitor or a floor manager. Even in his disguise as a cashier, Barron Trump was still Barron Trump. With a single word, he could shift the responsibility onto someone else. But he didn't. Something deep inside him stopped him. This moment wasn't just about cleaning up spilled eggs. It was symbolic, a small but profound act that mirrored something much larger. For the first time in his life, Barron wasn't just witnessing the consequences of other people's actions, he was confronting them head-on. As he carefully picked up the pieces of shell, his gaze wandered. Around him, the other cashiers were immersed in their tasks, their faces etched with quiet concentration and fatigue. They were young, some barely older than teenagers, their uniforms slightly wrinkled and their movements mechanical. It was the kind of exhaustion that came not just from long hours, but from the monotony of repetitive work and the weight of being overlooked. Nearby, a young woman stood at her register, her eyes briefly meeting Barron's as he cleaned the floor. She couldn't have been older than 20, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail and her expression marked by a tired smile. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement, a gesture that said, "I've been there. I understand." It wasn't pity or mockery. It was a quiet solidarity born from shared experience. Barron nodded back, his throat tightening. For a moment, he wanted to explain himself, to tell her this wasn't who he really was, that this was just an experiment. But the words never came. What good would it do? His reasons didn't matter. What mattered was the realization washing over him like a tidal wave. For years, Barron had floated through life without noticing the people who kept it running smoothly. He had passed by workers in hotels, restaurants, and stores, barely acknowledging their existence, let alone their effort. And now, for the first time, he saw the truth. He had been part of the problem. This wasn't just a simple exercise in role-playing anymore. It was turning into something much deeper, something that gnawed at his heart and refused to let go. Barron had stepped into this supermarket to observe others, to study how people treated someone they viewed as insignificant. But now, the experiment was reshaping him. It wasn't just about how customers treated cashiers. It was about the invisible struggles millions of people faced every single day. Barron stood up slowly, wiping his sticky hands on a paper towel he had grabbed from under the counter. His eyes swept over the bustling store, watching the other employees with fresh clarity. There was the young woman who had smiled at him, now gently explaining a return policy to an impatient customer. 2 registers down, a lanky young man in his late teens tried to stifle a yawn as he scanned items for a woman with 3 restless children tugging at her cart. Behind the scenes, he imagined the stock clerks hauling boxes, the janitors cleaning spills, the managers juggling complaints. These people weren't just names on a schedule. They were human beings, each carrying their own burdens, their own dreams, their own silent battles. And yet, the world treated them as little more than tools, faceless, replaceable, invisible. Barron's thoughts began to spiral. He had always believed in the power of progress, in the idea that great leaders could shape a better future. But as he stood there, surrounded by the hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic beeping of registers, a question lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. What's the point of progress if it leaves people behind? We build towering skyscrapers and design cutting-edge technology, he thought. But why are the people laying the bricks or running the registers still being treated like they don't matter? A wave of guilt washed over him. All his life, Barron had been told he was destined for greatness, that he had the potential to make a difference. But what kind of difference could he make if he didn't even understand the people he claimed he wanted to help? It was easy to talk about change from the comfort of a boardroom or a penthouse. It was much harder to face the messy, complicated reality of it on the ground. He glanced back at the young woman who had smiled at him earlier. She was now chatting with an elderly customer, her tone light and friendly despite the weariness in her posture. She didn't need to know who Barron was. None of them did. It didn't matter that he came from a family of immense privilege or that the world saw him as a future leader. What mattered was that they deserved something so simple yet so rare: respect. Barron resolved, then and there, to give them that, not just in his temporary role as a cashier, but in his life moving forward. He would carry this lesson with him, not as a fleeting moment of empathy, but as a fundamental shift in how he viewed the world. As the day wore on, Barron returned to his post behind the register, scanning items and interacting with customers. But now, every interaction felt different. Each time someone ignored him or barked at him impatiently, he absorbed the experience, letting it shape his understanding of the world he had been blind to for so long. The pain of being invisible, of being undervalued, it wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. It was real, tangible, and it left a mark on Barron that he knew would never fade. But instead of letting that pain crush him, he chose to channel it into something greater, a purpose, a commitment to change, not just the way he lived, but the way he influenced the lives of others. Barron Trump was no longer just an observer in an experiment. He was a participant in a world far more complex than he had ever imagined. As his shift came to an end, Barron Trump unpinned the name tag from his shirt and held it in his hand for a moment. The simple piece of plastic, with the name Barry scrawled across it in bold black letters, felt heavier than it should have. It represented more than just a temporary role. It was a gateway into a world he had never truly understood. Sliding the tag into his pocket, Barron stepped outside into the cool evening air, his mind swirling with thoughts and emotions he could barely contain. The supermarket parking lot was quiet now, illuminated by the soft glow of scattered streetlights. Barron stood there for a moment, staring out at the rows of parked cars, the faint hum of distant traffic filling the silence. His thoughts were consumed by the people he had worked alongside, the struggles he had witnessed, and the indignities he had experienced firsthand. The fatigue of the day weighed on him, but it wasn't the kind of exhaustion he had expected. It was something deeper, more profound. Barron began to walk, his footsteps echoing faintly on the pavement. His mind raced with ideas, visions of how things could be better. He thought about the young cashiers he had worked with, barely out of high school, juggling long shifts with schoolwork or family obligations. He thought about the middle-aged woman who had silently picked up her spilled belongings after being bumped by the arrogant man, her quiet resignation leaving an indelible mark on him. These were the people who kept the world running, yet their voices were rarely heard, their contributions often overlooked. What if we could change that? Barron thought. His ideas grew more vivid with every step. Programs to amplify the voices of workers, giving them a platform to share their stories and struggles. Initiatives to improve working conditions, ensuring fair wages, comprehensive benefits, and mental health support for those who bore the brunt of society's demands. Barron imagined creating a culture where respect wasn't a rare exception but an ingrained norm, a fundamental part of how people treated one another, regardless of their role or status. The more he thought about it, the more ambitious his vision became. He didn't just want to make changes in a single store or even a single industry. Barron envisioned a global movement, one that would challenge the very fabric of societal norms and power dynamics. A movement that would remind the world that dignity and respect weren't luxuries, they were rights, and he would be the one to lead it. As he reached his car, a sleek black sedan that felt almost out of place in the modest parking lot, Barron hesitated. He glanced back at the supermarket, now nearly deserted, its fluorescent lights still casting their harsh glow over the empty aisles. For a moment, he felt a pang of guilt returning to the world of luxury he had always known. But he also felt a spark of determination. He wasn't going back as the same person who had entered that store hours earlier. The drive home was quiet, the city lights flashing by in a blur as Barron navigated the familiar streets back to his family's estate. When he finally arrived, the gates opened smoothly, revealing the sprawling mansion bathed in warm light. But tonight, it felt different. The grandeur of the home, the perfectly manicured lawns, the towering columns, they all seemed detached, almost foreign, like they belonged to another world entirely. Barron stepped inside, the sound of his shoes echoing softly against the marble floors. The house was quiet, its vastness amplified in the stillness of the evening. He passed through the grand dining room, where countless lavish parties had been held, the kind that drew in the wealthy and powerful. As he glanced at the long table, polished to perfection, memories of those gatherings came flooding back. He thought about the people who had attended, individuals like the arrogant man from earlier in the day, people who had everything but often showed so little regard for those who had less. He shook his head, the frustration bubbling up again. Those parties, those conversations, they suddenly felt shallow, devoid of the kind of substance that really mattered. What good was wealth or influence if it only perpetuated inequality and indifference? Barron made his way to his study, a room that had always been a sanctuary for him. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with titles on economics, politics, history, topics his family had encouraged him to master. But as his eyes scanned the spines of those books, his thoughts drifted elsewhere. The lessons they held seemed distant, disconnected from the kind of change he now knew was necessary. Tonight, Barron wasn't thinking about grand ambitions or lofty strategies. He was thinking about people, real people, and the small, meaningful ways their lives could be improved. He sat down at his desk, the smooth wooden surface cool under his fingertips. The room was quiet, save for the faint rustle of papers as he pulled out a notebook. For a moment, he simply sat there, the events of the day replaying in his mind, the monotony of scanning items, the indifferent stares from customers, the cutting words of the man in the suit. But it wasn't discouragement that filled him now. It was purpose. Barron picked up a pen, the tip hovering over the blank page. This wasn't going to be a plan to boost his reputation or solidify his influence. It wasn't going to be another checklist of achievements to satisfy his family's expectations. This was something different, something personal. Slowly, he began to write. His words flowed onto the page, capturing ideas he had never dared to articulate before. Thoughts about creating a world where workers were valued not just for their labor, but for their humanity. About fostering a culture where kindness and empathy were celebrated, not seen as weaknesses. About using his privilege not as a shield, but as a tool to dismantle the systems that kept so many people struggling. As the night deepened, Barron wrote with a quiet determination, his pen moving steadily across the pages. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of inspiration. It was the start of something much bigger. And for the first time, Barron felt that his life's purpose was finally beginning to take shape. Ideas began to take shape. Worker benefit programs, campaigns to raise awareness about respect and compassion, and a call for global leaders to join in making a change. What would happen if every company, every major organization, reevaluated how they treated their employees? What would happen if people, regardless of wealth or status, began to look at each other with empathy? Barron stood, his eyes bright with a clarity he hadn't felt before. Tomorrow, Barron Trump, the heir to a prominent family, the son of a former president, would face the world as usual. But inside, he had undergone a profound transformation. Behind the fame and the spotlight, Barron now carried a new mission: to change the world not just through grand strategies, but through small, meaningful actions, through kindness, respect, and compassion. As he stepped into his bedroom, one final thought crossed his mind. If I can change, the world can change too. The house fell into silence, but within Barron, a quiet light began to glow. Tomorrow would be a new beginning, not just for him to explore who he was, but to help build a world where no one was forgotten. And that, he knew, was a future worth fighting for.